This is For the Rest of Us with Ken and Megan Castellan, a podcast about theology, faith, the Bible, and life. You know, for the rest of us. Well, welcome back to For the Rest of Us with the Reverend Canon Megan Castellan. You figured it out by now. I don't need to keep reminding you about this, but it's just my spiel, so get used to it. I am not, as you can tell, the Reverend Megan Castellan. I am just Adam Eichelberger. I work with Megan at the Episcopal Diocese of Central New York. I'm a lifelong Catholic. Now I'm a baby Episcopalian. I'm just trying to figure this all out. You can kind of consider me the Stimpy.
You're the boss!
To her Wren.
You sick little monkey!
And sometimes we like to get a little weird, but she's just trying to help me figure this all out through the lens of what we think and believe in the Episcopal Church. Megan, what do we got this episode for the rest of us?
Like so many of us, I find in times of quandary, I start to read about fascism in other countries. And recently, I started reading about the roots of apartheid in South Africa, as, you know, I'm sure we all do.
A rabbit hole we've all fell down at one point.
A rabbit hole we've all fell down at some point or another. Part of the reason is, you know, it's sort of the corollary to Godwin's law, I guess. That thing that on the internet at some point someone's going to call you a Nazi. We tend to make all sorts of comparisons to the Third Reich all the time. And we've talked about Christianity's role in that on this show. But I realized that I don't know a lot about apartheid in South Africa. Just sort of like bare bones. It ended. Desmond Tutu was there. Now we have Elon Musk. And, you know, there's not a whole lot past that I know. I do remember as a baby Episcopalian when I was a kid hearing about the struggle against apartheid in church. And I don't know if this was sort of unique to my part of the church, but we talked about the struggle against apartheid. We talked about Desmond Tutu. We sang Siyahamba in Sunday school and we stomped around the parish hall. And my parents had my brother and I watch Nelson Mandela be freed from prison, 1990. And so this was like a large presence in my life. And up until fairly recently, I assumed that this was a widespread American phenomenon. And then I found out it was not. So I wanted to kind of get further into this. And it's important to recognize that like Nazism in Germany, apartheid had a religious component. Like in Germany, there was a predominant church in South Africa that explicitly endorsed and promoted apartheid as being God's will and being a fundamental part of Christianity. It promoted it for decades, even as other parts of the Christian church within South Africa worked to dismantle apartheid and to push against it. And so that's why I wanted to kind of take a deep dive into apartheid in South Africa on this show. And we're going to talk about it over 3 episodes, I think, because the parallels of how apartheid was structured, how it was promoted by the church, and how it ultimately fell, I think can be instructive for some of what we're facing in our own historical moment in the US. So in this episode, I want to talk about how apartheid got started in South Africa, sort of what the roots of that particular culture were. And I also want to say I'm not an expert. This is going to be like top of Mount Everest, very high overview. So if I make a mistake, kindly let us know, but don't at me. So South Africa, like a lot of other places, was subject to European colonialism. In the early 1600s, the first settlers arrived in what would become the Cape of Good Hope. They were Dutch. They were Dutch Calvinists. And Calvinism in the Netherlands had a very particular flavor. They established what would become the Dutch Reformed Church, which is going to become the predominant church for white people in South Africa when we fast forward. They are going to be joined pretty soon by fleeing French Huguenots, also Calvinists from France, also with a very particular form of Calvinism. And so early on, we get the settlements of South Africa to be a very particular, very sort of apocalyptic type of Calvinism. This is your John Calvin establishing a theocracy in Geneva type of Calvinism. This is not quite John Calvin writing sort of hopeful utopian ideals in the Institutes of Religion. This is a hardened John Calvin. Incidentally, this is roughly the same time period as the Pilgrims flee England, go to the Netherlands, get kicked out, and head to Massachusetts Bay Colony. So while they're doing that, the first Dutch settlers are, again, Calvinists coming from Holland to what will become South Africa. Same group of people. Lots of the same ideas about themselves. As you know from colonialism, the Dutch are not particularly good at holding an empire. They kind of get out over their skis, although they are super good at being cruel in the parts of the world where their empire spreads. The English also follow on their heels pretty soon after. They establish essentially a competing government in the region of South Africa. They occupy the Cape of Good Hope by 1806, and there is significant conflict between the descendants of the Dutch, who begin to call themselves Afrikaners, and who begin to see themselves as native in a lot of ways to the land, and the incoming English, who establish a more permanent government, who have different ways of doing things, and who have a different system around Christianity. The Church Missionary Society begins to come in and set up churches. There is going to be ongoing conflict between these two groups. And so this, kind of gets kicked off in a couple of flashpoints when the British outlaw slavery. This really ticks off the Afrikaners. They were using slaves on their plantations, and they are mad because they don't get paid for their labor. So this is in 1834. They launch what's called the Great Trek, and they move inland from the Cape. So they make a big trek inwards, and they found two competing republics called the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. So the Afrikaners, over about 50 years, will trek inward to try and avoid British control. As this happens, they start to develop a narrative about themselves, that they are freedom-loving people, that they are uniquely tied to the land in a way that the British are not, and that it is God's will that they spread the gospel in this benighted part of the world.
It is remarkable and gross how often that phrase gets said. It is God's will.
Yeah, it's going to get worse. So they kind of keep moving inland in the Great Trek to escape British control and British rule without a whole lot of success. And they kick off actual wars anytime somebody discovers an actual resource that they want. Gold is discovered, and they have like a short 10-week long, they have the Boer War, which was a short war, and it was fairly ridiculous aside from the loss of life. And the reason I say it was fairly ridiculous is some of the names of the battles were the Battle of the Carrots. The British lost badly, and they didn't seem super invested in the fighting. They did things like forget to bring their artillery with them to what became South Africa, and they would give away their position in one battle that I read about by climbing up a mountain and yelling insults down to the Boers, who is another name for the Afrikaners, and yelling at them, who then opened fire from below and killed most of them. I mean, it's just sort of like total nonsense, which would be funnier if all the people didn't die.
It's got big Monty Python energy.
Yeah, big Monty Python energy. Britain was also having trouble at home. This was, right after the extended French and Indian Wars and the 100 Years' War. And like they were just like not emotionally invested in this particular conflict. So it was not great for them. The end result from this first one is that the Transvaal Republic gets marginal independence, and so does the Orange Free State. So the Afrikaners, the Boers, are super proud of themselves. The problem is that someone then discovers gold, lots of gold everywhere. And so now a ton of outlanders come from England and the rest of the British Empire into Transvaal and the Orange Free State. And the Afrikaners, the Boers, try to pass legislation to limit their rights, to stop them from voting, because they're worried about losing control again. And the British come back, invade again, and say, no, this is our gold. And this launches the Second Boer War. This one is way worse. This one is when the British invent concentration camps. In the Second Boer War, the Afrikaners relied on guerrilla tactics. Again, they were spread throughout the community, and so they would just sort of attack the British wherever they could find them and cut supply lines, kind of like hit and run sort of tactics. As the war dragged on, the British decided to confront this tactic by rounding up every Afrikaner they could find and putting them in internment camps, which they called concentration camps. It's the first use of concentration camps in warfare. Men, women, children, they restricted their rations based on if they knew the men of the family were away fighting. It was a way to put pressure on them. They did the same to the native Africans who were not involved at the war at all. They were just hanging out. I mean, notice at no point in this story so far have we talked about what the indigenous Africans wanted or needed. They were not involved in this story to this point. It's an argument between the Dutch and the British, but the British decided to take this opportunity just to intern all of the indigenous Africans too, because they thought, well, maybe they might join with the Dutch. We don't know. We'll round them up just to be sure. Way more people died in the camps than they died in the war. Disease, malnutrition were endemic. It was absolutely horrific. This did prompt the Afrikaners to surrender by the early 1900s, just in order to get their families out of the camps. And the British took over the Transvaal state and the Orange state, and in 1910, the Union of South Africa was created as part of the British Empire. 1934, South Africa became a self-governing nation. So out of this, you have the Afrikaners, who feel themselves to be a beleaguered group, oppressed by the British, not given their due, at one with the land in this particular way they had sacrificed so much for, and coming off this horrible war where they were oppressed, they were put in camps, their families were destroyed, they lost all of this, which, so some legitimate grievances coupled with this Calvinist belief that whatever happens is the will of God and is predestined, and they have been predestined to struggle and to survive in this wilderness in order to manifest the gospel. Immediately, when South Africa becomes a self-governing nation, the Afrikaners are elected into power. Immediately, their initial documents restrict voting to people in certain economic classes, which bars most indigenous Africans from voting. They establish a minister of native affairs to deal with native Africans, but Black Africans were otherwise unrepresented in the government. This was a country explicitly for white people in South Africa. The Afrikaners, who formed the Nationalist Party, tightened control between 1934 until 1947, when they voted in the framework for what becomes apartheid. But even from the start of the Union of South Africa, if you were a Black South African, you had to carry a legal pass in order to travel. You could only own a limited amount of land, which was later further restricted under apartheid. You couldn't marry outside of your race, and you had to get permission to do it. Your life was extremely restricted. Apartheid comes in and creates a whole legal network of what's called separate development that is explicitly about maintaining the absolute authority of the Afrikaner minority, with the British portion of the white minority sort of tagged on. But it's explicitly initially about maintaining Afrikaner control. So through that really brief historical kind of overview, we can see how the Afrikaners over time, and we're going to talk about this more next time, develop this view of themselves as this people chosen by God to suffer through history, that they were beleaguered, that they were oppressed, that they were the righteous victims, but they were called by God to be faithful and to show his glory so that the gospel could come to South Africa. And so because of that story, it became very important to them that they had to hang on to, at all costs, absolute unquestioned power for their safety and the survival of the nation. So part of what I find interesting about this are the ways in which people shape narratives about themselves and the way that that kind of affects the politics of a country. I mean, when I was reading about the Afrikaners, and there was a lot in the 80s being written about Afrikaner Christianity and sort of the ways they saw themselves. There are some pretty glaring similarities between the way the Pilgrims talked about themselves and the way the Afrikaners talked about themselves and continue to talk about themselves. The language of a light on a hill, the chosen people. The Afrikaners are also going to pick up this explicit chosen people parallel and really drive it home. And when they construct their theology around apartheid, that's what they're going to use. And that's language that is all through what the Pilgrims wrote and how we still talk about American history in a lot of ways. When we talk about American exceptionalism and some of the corners of our sort of civil mythology, this idea that we are special, that we are chosen, that the settlers who came here were special and chosen, and they suffered, but they suffered for a reason, and they suffered to make the country survive. And And these kind of self-mythologizing stories that we tell ourselves, what is the impact that these stories have down the road?
It's also interesting the parallels between that and what we see going on now. This idea of oppression that isn't actually oppression.
Mhm,
That's not what's going on here. This need to kind of project that onto oneself to feel like a victim, so that so that you can justify your position in a certain
mhm.
context. That's kind of telling.
Yeah. I mean, the camp stuff is horrific, and I didn't know about it before I was reading about this. And it's not oppression to not be compensated for your loss of free labor that you've been exploiting for years and years and years. That's not oppression. That's setting right a historical wrong. And again, what was kind of glaring to me looking at the history of like the Boer War and the way the British and Dutch were fighting is at no point was anybody like, hey, Zulu people, do you have a stake in this? Do you want to talk about like it was just assumed so deeply that the actual people who lived in South Africa would not be able to govern themselves or do anything. Like, of course, we can't let Black South Africans do anything. No, we just don't. And there were a couple of times on the Great Trek when Afrikaners were kind of taken out by Zulu war parties and would get into it with local tribes, and that was a whole thing. But it was never taken seriously as a reason to stop or a reason to consider the humanity of the people you lived among. It was, it's us and the British. These people don't even count as a threat. Mind-boggling.
It really is. This is a lot for us to dive into, which is why we're splitting it up over several episodes. So we encourage you guys, if you have any questions about any of this stuff, or maybe you notice something, you're like, hey, what about this? Or you wanted to share, please feel free to hit us up in the comments. No matter where you are listening to the show, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, your favorite podcast app, please feel free to leave us a comment or ask a question, or go to our website, cnyepiscopal.org, and you can hit the button for podcasts and you can submit a question to us or a comment right through the website. So normally how we end our show when we record is I always ask Megan for a recommendation about something fun, but it kind of feels weird asking for a fun, cutesy recommendation when we're talking about something that is icky and very serious. So instead of that, I wouldn't call it a fun fact, but Megan did actually share with me an interesting fact about something related to this. So Megan, what is your fact of the day when it comes to this topic of dealing with apartheid and Afrikaners?
So I am an avid knitter. It is the way that I deal with the winter up here. And the British general in charge of marshalling the British troops during the Second Boer War was Lord Kitchener. If you also knit, that you know that the stitch used to close the toe on knitted socks is called the Kitchener stitch, and it is named after him. So, fellow knitters of the world, we got to find a different name for that thing so that it's not named after the guy who invented concentration camps, because I don't like doing the Kitchener stitch. It's annoying, but it's better than concentration camps, guys.
Absolutely. Well, there you go. There's your fact of the day when it comes to this. Hey, do us a favor. If you're liking the show, 2 things you can do to help. Make sure you leave us a comment on whatever platform you're listening to the show, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, your favorite podcast app. You can go to our website, cnyepiscopal.org, and hit the podcast button. You can leave us a question or a comment on the For the Rest of Us page. And hey, also leave us a review. We've seen that more and more of you are leaving reviews, and it's getting out to more people. So keep it up. Share it with somebody. Make sure you leave us a review, especially if it's 5 stars. If it's not, keep it to yourself. And we look forward to talking to you next time on For the Rest of Us.
Hooray!
Thanks for stopping by and checking out For the Rest of Us with Ken and Megan. If you like the show, maybe subscribe, share it with a friend, leave us a review, and we hope to see you again next time. For the Rest of Us is a production of the Episcopal Diocese of Central New York.